After more than 7 years of never-ending conflict in Syria, does one of the world's most famous war crimes prosecutors believe there'll ever be justice for the victims? And also on the show, is Gaza on the brink of war? I'm Mehdi Hassan. More than 200 dead in Gaza this year alone. 3 Palestinian kids killed in an Israeli airstrike earlier this week. Rockets fired into Israel from Gaza. Are we on the verge of another all-out war? That's our discussion. But first, the world continues to fail Syria, with the international community unable to prevent crimes against humanity. War criminals were prosecuted both in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. But what chance of that happening in Syria? And could a leader of the United States or the UK ever be brought in front of an international tribunal? I'll ask this week's headliner, former war crimes chief prosecutor Carla del Ponte. Carla del Ponte, thanks for joining me on UpFront. More than a year ago, you resigned in protest from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, a special investigative committee set up by the UN. You said that you were frustrated, that you gave up, that there is no justice for Syria, you said. Why is that, and who do you think is to blame?
First of all, I confirm what you are saying. Yes, I resign in protest because the Security Council is guilty on this situation, because the Security Council did not take a decision to put in place a tribunal ad hoc or to refer to the Permanent Criminal Court. So in Syria, after 6 years in the Commission, trying to obtain a justice for the victims, and it was not possible. Nobody is listening to us, to the Commission, and in Syria is still total impunity.
When you said that the UN Commission was not backed by any political will, for example, which countries on the Security Council were you referring to? Which countries specifically lacked the political will that you were looking for?
Oh, it's well known. It is Russia. First of all, it's Russia and China. And Russia uses the veto right, so they stopped each resolution that want to put in place an international tribunal. It was not possible. It is still not possible, because Russia is still putting an obstacle to each decision to obtain justice for the victims.
Isn't there a bit of a contradiction, though, when we hear you talk about Russia? Because right now you're saying Russia is to blame. But in 2016, when the Russians were intervening in Syria, bombing in Syria, tilting the war in favor of Bashar al-Assad, you praised it. You said it was a good thing that Russia had intervened because, quote, someone is attacking these terrorist groups. What is your position on Russia and the Syrian war? Because you seem to be all over the place.
You know, you must make a difference between the military, the justice point, the military point, the political point. So if you see Russia now, Russia is probably trying to obtain a peace accord in Syria, as we know from the press. But military, it was at that time, I don't know, not now when, that Russia was helping the regime of Assad, and it was fighting against terrorism. You have other reports of this commission that you can read that Russia is responsible for civilians' death, and that is another episode.
I understand the point you're making.
Yeah.
You're saying separate them out. They can intervene to fight terrorism and kill civilians at the same time. I'm saying, but you as someone who's sitting on a UN commission at that time, do you regret making those comments? Because at the moment you made those comments in February 2016, at that time Amnesty was criticizing Russia for bombing civilian targets. How can you investigate war crimes while praising a party that's accused of war crimes?
You know, I disagree with you totally. I disagree with you totally.
Okay.
Because It is a war is going on 7 years now, and in these 7 years you have a different attitude from the parties who are fighting this war, and particularly the Commission of Crimes against humanity and war crimes. So, if I'm speaking as former prosecutor, I'm telling you total impunity in Syria, and that is unacceptable. And Security Council is a guilty institution of that. If I'm speaking about a member of the Commission, because the Commission is violation of human rights, and not each violation of human rights is a crime. So you can describe in these reports that we present to the Council of Human Rights, we described what happened in reality.
Okay.
And that
you said at the time that Russia's intervention was justified because finally someone is attacking these terrorist groups. But as you know, the Assad government has labeled just about everyone who isn't on the side of the regime a terrorist. Weren't you worried that that kind of language from you, a member of the Commission, would give a green light to Syria and to Russia to escalate their bombardment?
No. Nobody from the Commission, and not me, is given green light to the Russian to bombard. Absolutely not. Russian intervene with the Assad regime against terrorist groups, particularly ISIS, Daesh, and that for me was absolutely positive.
On May the 6th, 2013, following a chemical attack in Syria outside of Aleppo 2 months earlier, you said we have no indication at all that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons, and that according to what we have established so far, it is at the moment opponents of the regime who are using sarin gas. Ever since you said that, supporters of the Assad government have used your quote to suggest it's the rebels who are carrying out all the chemical attacks, not the Assad government. Does that bother you, and do you still stand by that statement?
I absolutely stay on that statement, because that also, you see, it was at the beginning of the use of chemical weapons. So, in one interview I said the first elements of evidences that we have is that the rebels have used chemical weapons. Since then, the Commission established that the regime used chemical weapons. Yes. But we were not able to investigate, and we were not allowed to investigate, unfortunately, because until today you don't know exactly who used what of chemical weapons.
But that's not what you said at the time. You said we have no indication it was the government. Hold on. You said it is at the moment opponents of the regime who are using sarin gas.
At that time.
But the UN disowned your comments at the time, on that very day. The UN said at the time, we wish to clarify the Commission has not reached any conclusive findings on the use of chemical weapons. Did you speak too soon because your own UN colleagues disowned your remark at the time?
It's true that my colleagues were not happy about that, but I think that if you tell the truth, it's the best attitude that you can have. And as former prosecutor, I know that. So, at the beginning of the use of chemical weapons, the only elements we have of evidence were that the rebels used it. Since then, we have many other episodes, and we could establish, the Commission could establish that the regime used chemical weapons, the rebels used chemical weapons, regime in more episodes than the rebels. But what I want to tell you is that it is a shame that the international community, and in particular the Security Council and the UN, don't do nothing to establish exactly who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons.
Before Syria, you were called the world's most powerful criminal lawyer. You were working as a prosecutor for the international tribunals on war crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Slobodan Milosevic famously attacked you as the new Gestapo, I think he called you. You sent some of the worst criminals of the 20th century to prison. Why was justice possible in Rwanda and in the Balkans, but not in Syria?
Because the Security Council didn't want that, because it's the Security Council who don't want that justice is also in Syria for the victims. Because former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Security Council decided to constitute an international tribunal and to that deal with the crimes that were committed, war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. But unfortunately, it is a political decision from the Security Council who allowed an international institution, a tribunal ad hoc, to obtain justice for the victims. The weak point is that it is a political decision.
But those decisions are made not just by governments, they're made by prosecutors. You once expressed a willingness to press charges against NATO personnel for alleged war crimes in 1999. In December 1999, you told The Guardian you were up for that. NATO had broken the Geneva Conventions. Then 6 months later, you changed your mind. You did a 100% U-turn and said, NATO didn't do anything wrong, you're not going to investigate them. Why did you do that U-turn?
I did not. We open an investigation when we have concrete element of evidences. And we had one element, I remember very well. It was a bombardment from an American pilot on a civilians convoy. And the pilot said, I see they are civilians, and he received the order to bombard. And 120 civilians were killed. We opened an investigation, but it was not possible to conduct this investigation to the end. That's the reason why we were not able.
But this is what you said in June 2000. There is no basis for opening an investigation into any of the allegations. Although some mistakes were made by NATO, I'm very satisfied that there was no deliberate targeting of civilians.
About?
You said, although some mistakes were made by NATO, I'm very satisfied there was no deliberate targeting of civilians. But human rights groups don't agree with you on that.
I don't know which episode you are recalling.
You were referring to the war in general. You said during... No, I'm quoting you. Carla, I'm quoting you. You said, let me quote you again.
No, the war in general. I'm not speaking about the war in general.
But you were in 2000. You said, I'm very satisfied.
Never.
There was no deliberate targeting of civilians by NATO during the bombing campaign. But human rights groups disagree with you. You disagreed with you 6 months earlier.
I disagree what you are saying. You are not correct in what you are referring that I am speaking about.
Okay, let me ask you now then, since you're disagreeing with your quote. Do you believe that NATO only made mistakes during its bombing campaign of Kosovo and there were no potential war crimes worth investigating? What's your position? You tell me.
I have only one investigation. I opened just one investigation about the responsibility of NATO committing crimes. But I could not end this investigation and issuing an indictment.
Why?
Because it was not possible to collect the evidence because the states are refusing to cooperate with the tribunal. Ecco, why? What is it? Because, and it is not the only. Although in other cases we could not end our investigation because it was not able to collect enough evidences to issue an indictment. That is the task of a prosecutor.
Okay, so to be clear then, they may have committed war crimes, it's just you were not able to investigate it fully. It's not that they're innocent of war crimes, it's that you were prevented from investigating them in a full way. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Last question then.
Exactly.
Do you think it's possible that a president of the United States or a prime minister of the UK could ever be brought in front of a war crimes tribunal, or is that a pipe dream? Is that a fantasy?
Theoretically, it's possible. Under the international law, it's possible. But in practice, practical, it's not possible. Because as I told you, international justice is possible only if the political will is in existence. But we must fight to obtain justice for all the victims of the war crimes, crimes against humanity, by the high responsible, political and military responsible for the commission of these crimes. But of course, the ideal situation is far away from now, particularly now, I must say.
Carla del Ponte, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Okay.
Gaza is imploding, and we remain on the brink of another potentially devastating conflict. The words of the UN Special Envoy to the Middle East. This past week has seen even more violence and escalations, with rockets fired from Gaza into Israel and an Israeli airstrike killing 3 Palestinian children in Gaza. Since the Great March of Return protests began earlier this year, Israeli security forces have killed more than 200 people in Gaza and wounded more than 18,000. So, is another full-scale Israeli attack on the Strip inevitable. Joining me to discuss this are Donald MacIntyre, former Jerusalem correspondent for The Independent and author of the book Gaza Preparing for Dawn, and Najla Shawa, a Palestinian humanitarian aid worker based in Gaza. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Najla, let me start with you. Do you believe that another war in Gaza is imminent? Because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claims he's trying to avoid one.
Unfortunately, the situation in Gaza keeps on becoming complicated more and more by the day. The fear of the people is always to face another large-scale escalation. But we must say that almost every week we are at a risk of such escalation due to the disproportionate reaction of the Israelis at the border, but because there's a lot of side talks, hidden discussions that people are not fully or even partly aware of that are in the picture, it's just becoming more and more complicated to really even analyze or predict anything.
Don MacIntyre, Gaza yet again plagued by violence. Things look like they're escalating. Is this just more depressing bad news out of Gaza, as we've seen week in, week out, year in, year out for the last few years? Or is this a tipping point?
Well, I think, as Najla was saying, it's a very, very fragile and dangerous situation. I mean, I think the most positive thing that one can say about it is that it seems like neither Hamas nor Israel really want a war right now if it can be avoided. And the Egyptians also don't want a war because they're worried that it will play back into North Sinai if it happens. So Gazans face this really terribly difficult situation in which, as Najla was saying, you know, one minute you're hearing that there's a positive development, the Israelis have allowed Qatar to send in some fuel, there seems to be a slight muting of the violence, and then it blows up again.
Najla, on the protests themselves, what is the end game? Is there an end game? Is there an understanding you have out there in Gaza as to what's going to happen next from the Palestinian side, from the protesters' side?
The problem is people are very desperate. Those who go to the border are young people who have, unfortunately, nothing to lose, and they want to do something. They want to do something to change their lives. I mean, we have been for years and years in blockade. We have no answer to anything. We have been for decades trying to do peace, and there is no answer. And again, there are no potential, even light at the end of the tunnel.
The Israelis call their frequent attacks on Gaza, quote, mowing the lawn. What kind of strategy is that, if you can even call it a strategy?
Well, I think it's right that particularly right-wing commentators and politicians in Israel did develop this concept, which was an absolutely chilling and, in my view, indefensible one, which was that the way to, quote, pacify Gaza was every few years to go in huge force, as they did in 2008-9, again in 2012, and again in 2014. And that will somehow keep Gaza quiet. Now, I think even some people in Israel, particularly in the military, are beginning to wake up to the fact that for their own security reasons, as much as anything else, that may not be the best strategy. But then, on the other hand, Israel is coming up and facing an election where there's a lot of right-wing pressure to mow the grass again. And one can only hope that that pressure is resisted.
Najla, isn't part of the problem, though, for the people of Gaza that the leadership and the political conditions on the ground in Gaza are so dire right now? It allows the Israelis to say the problems in Gaza are not caused by us, they're caused by misrule, they're caused by Hamas, they're caused by corruption. It's nothing to do with us. If Gaza was a liberal democracy, everything would be fine, but it's all Hamas's fault.
Of course, I mean, that's part of the complication of the picture here is the Palestinian divide, and we know that for a fact, and it is harming the people of Gaza and Palestinians in general and the Palestinian cause. So yes, inside there are no troops, but Israel controls everything. The people cannot simply leave. They cannot have their basic health needs, and that's not because of Hamas. That's because of Israel. Now, of course, taking it to the next level, between Hamas and Fatah, that's a big problem, and the Palestinians are fed up.
But Najla, you're right to say that it's not the fault of Hamas that there's a lack of health care or the blockade. But on the other hand, Human Rights Watch has a report out recently which pointed out that both in the West Bank and in Gaza, the Palestinian factions, Hamas and the PA, have been carrying out abuse, torture, deprivation of rights. How do people in Gaza feel about the fact that they've got the Israelis oppressing them from outside, and in many ways they've got Hamas oppressing them from inside?
Yeah, unfortunately, no one can deny that, and unfortunately, nobody is surprised by such findings of such reports. By both sides, we all realize that both are not being accountable to their people, and they are not they're not helping as they should be, and these violations are being fighted against by the civil society in both areas, but there is a lot of resistance from these factions. Absolutely, and it's all political.
Don, the Israelis always say that all the problems in Gaza are the fault of Hamas, which is obviously absurd. But in your experience, in your view, you were in Gaza very recently, you've written this book about Gaza. How much has Hamas made things worse on the ground in Gaza? I don't just mean in material terms, but I mean their very presence and the way they run the place has provided the international community with an excuse to maybe look away and say, well, you know, the classic Donald Trump formula, both sides are to blame here.
Yes, well, look, you know, there's no doubt, as Najla was saying, you mentioned the Human Rights Watch report. I have some stuff in my book about Hamas behaving at times pretty repressively, and there's no question of that. And you know, they're not a cuddly organization in that sense. However, after they won elections in 2006, which were attested by all international observers to be free and fair elections, that, it seems to me, should have been seems to me, and I should say an increasing number of diplomats who were involved at the time, say so privately now, should have engaged with Hamas, and that was a terrible mistake.
Rather than cut them off,
rather than
try
cut
and
them
do a coup,
because of
and
course,
then bring in a blockade.
Precisely.
Just on the US role, Donald Trump, Jared Kushner are best buddies with Netanyahu and co. Surely, sadly, there can't be any hope for Gaza or the situation on the ground while Trump is in office, basically giving an American green light to anything that Netanyahu wants to do. We know that if there is another full-scale war in Gaza, the Americans aren't going to lift a finger. Not that they did before, but definitely not now.
No, I think that's right, if there's a war. I mean, actually, there are rather conflicting signals on Gaza coming out of the administration. I mean, on the one hand, we keep hearing rather tantalizingly that Kushner and Greenblatt are working on some kind of rehabilitation plan for Gaza. Very much half the story was what's needed, but that President Abbas is against this because he doesn't want a separate deal between the international community and Israel on the one hand and Hamas on the other. Against that, what Trump is actually doing practically is cutting aid to the Palestinians by an unprecedented amount, and in particular, in an effort to take the refugee issue off the table, is cutting aid, all the aid, to UNRWA, and that's disastrous, or potentially disastrous, in a place where over half the population are in fact refugees.
Najla, we focus a lot on the role of the Americans and the West in backing Israel, but what about your Arab neighbours? What about Egypt, which has helped Israel enforce this blockade of Gaza, or the UAE, which this week hosted Israeli Minister Miri Regev? Do you feel abandoned by your Arab neighbours?
Absolutely. I feel abandoned, but you know what? I also feel that finally this is the reality, that we have to see it and we have to face it. Egypt and the closure of the border, the way how they treat people at the Rafah border is extremely inhumane, and it's extremely unnecessary even. The situation with, I mean, Egypt's involvement in resolving is, of course, out of their political interest. And they must be part of this, part of any deal. And so, no, I mean, we are not considering this part of the Arab solidarity, if you will. So this has been changing dramatically.
And Najla, for the people of Gaza, what is the priority? Is it struggling to survive on a daily basis, or is there still a sense of ending the occupation, two-state solution, peace process? What are the priorities right now for people on the ground, do you think?
You know, the problem now is that, yes, there are the daily challenges, of course, and it's affecting more and more people than ever. So the majority are busy with really securing their daily basic needs. But in the bigger picture, even if you want to speak to people who are suffering on a daily basis, and they maybe have the ability to think a little bit about the bigger picture, they don't have any trust in any solution. I think what now people are really fearing is another political solution that can completely ignore the rights, again, of the people more than before, more than even previous peace agreements. That's what people realistically expect, that more denial of their rights.
And Don, last question to you. You've written this book on Gaza, you've spent time in Gaza, you've reported from Gaza. Do you think people in the West, even in government, not just members of the public, recognize how dire the situation on the ground is in Gaza and has been for many years?
No, I don't. And I think one of the tragedies of Gaza actually is that if there's a war, then huge attention swings onto Gaza. You know, it becomes a big media story even when there are other things going on in the world. And then as soon as that war is over, it dies, you know, as a story.
The suffering doesn't stop.
And the suffering doesn't stop. And also the factors that are leading up to the next war are very widely ignored by the media. And I think that's a huge problem.
Don MacIntyre, Najla, Shawa, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me on the show. UpFront will be back next week.